So next up in my synergy tier list is going to be Bleed. Bleed should probably be one of the more clear synergy types to tier commanders on, purely because of how Sinara functions with her silence and exciting effects. Basically anything that relies on weakness attacks or commander abilities is practically unusable with her, or if they are usable because of their stats, there will just be better alternatives that can still function alongside her. So, as a starting point, it's obviously going to be Sinara at the top, Jaime at the bottom, Leila at the bottom, purely because of this interaction with her 4-star, and then there will be pretty easy accompanying picks alongside them. So, Cersei, realistically, her stats are good enough to where she could be somewhat decent, but her entire functionality just doesn't work with the build because active abilities can't cast, so she'll be bottom tier. Sanel, again, you could argue again she could be C or B, because realistically her stats can make her somewhat decent. Yeah, she should probably be C tier, I guess, because of that, because the amount of cav stats she will give for like a mono cav build is decent enough. But Arya, active ability can't cast, so she's practically useless. Annie, same thing. Marge, same thing also. I guess Dana can probably go in alongside Sanel, although running cav bleed builds is significantly more common than spear bleed builds just because of weakness and female spear builds being so much better than any bleed alternatives. So again, maybe Dana could go down, but in terms of her stat giving an anti-counter, you can probably justify that spot. Winton, weakness attacks can't cast, and there's just better stat givers for cav. Salma, you could argue D tier, but I feel like her stats might justify C for the similar reasons that Dana and Sanel do. You can have her as like a 5th in a mono cav build potentially, and just the total health and the cav attack alone can get better value than any of this stuff down here could. And then you start getting into things which aren't impeded by Sinara's 4-star as much. Baelish and Dany sort of are, but they also function to a degree regardless, so it isn't as bad as stuff like Jaime or Arya or Winton or anything like that. So the other one that belongs up there with Sinara without doubt is Rhea. Without Rhea, you can't crit, or at least not to any large degree. You could through Merrel or Jon, but Rhea will be the main engine for both crits and bleeds. She of course synergizes amazingly with Sinara's extra normal attacks because that helps funnel into these crits that then become bleeds. And this line specifically, which says whenever allied troops land a critical hit, inflicts bleed on the target, makes Jon, by quite some distance, the best premium commander for the build. His damage reduction for the first 15 seconds is good, of course, but this allied infantry and non-front row troop types, that non-front row troop types only counts melee units when you actually test them. Bows can't crit. The tooltip is a bit unclear about that, but when you test it, that is the case. That they will have a 20% chance of dealing a critical strike with a higher modifier than Rhea has, and these will stack together, so the crits will be at 170%, and that lasts for 25 seconds, which is a big bulk of a fight, with fights lasting 40 seconds in total. So with Jon, every one of these crits you get will then of course be bleeds alongside them, and this is why Bleed Imp is probably the most popular whale build at the moment. Jon and Rhea together is just a ridiculous amount of damage, especially when you pair it with Sinara, with her weapon starred to decent degrees as well. So Jon will be an easy S tier as well. And to go alongside him will be Daeron. Daeron will be the 4th best commander here. It won't be Night King, despite him potentially being more expensive, or what his reputation might have you believe. The way Daeron synergizes with this build is so good. So this first part, the 50 normal attacks, synergizes with Sinara, but then this last bit synergizes amazingly with Rhea and Jon. So he works so well with the core of the build, and unless you have Jon, you won't be getting the full value of his 4-star ability here, because it effectively takes this from a 50% multiplier to a 200% multiplier. And the key thing of this ability is it acts in a similar way to Daenerys' dragon attack, or wildfire does, in that it hits all lines. So what you'll see happen is, in reports, you'll have Daeron, if you're rallying someone's castle, for example, he'll hit into their front line and do decent damage, of course, but then he'll hit into the second, third, and fourth lines too, where people don't have health and defense stats stacked up, and you'll guarantee him countering spears somewhere realistically against most people, and the damage numbers you'll get with him alongside these other three will be insane. The core synergy of the build, for mid-spenders especially, will just be these two commanders. Past that, it will mostly be stat givers, more so than huge amounts of synergy with these two specifically in terms of the high tier commanders until you get to that premium level. Kevin is probably the commander that synergizes with these two the most. You will counter weakness builds incredibly hard by the nature of this ability, because you'll stack the damage reduction onto the lineup which is being weakness attacked, and that is the biggest factor in bleed builds performing very well against weakness, and weakness among mid-spenders is the most popular build. That is a very important thing to keep in mind when you're building up a bleed lineup. As other mid-spender options to put alongside him, you have Latz. She will be the best imp stat giver, giving 90% imp attack, 90% imp health, and 92% imp defense. And her 4-star ability isn't blocked in any way by Sinara. I don't know why she isn't listed there actually. So this 4-star ability will take effect regardless of her silence and excite effects. So you'll get all the defense buffs, you'll get all the healing buffs. And through that, you can actually synergize in Patelo also, because despite Patelo having the reputation of being a weakness commander, he does in fact only synergize with healing. So Latz alone will be enough to gain the benefit of Patelo's 4-star. And because of the buffs he gives, and the fact that bleed is primarily ran with infantry units, and the fact he gives 90% inf attack, you can get a lot of value out of Patelo in mid-spender builds. In whale builds, you just don't really have the space for him. But a 5 of something like this for mid-spenders performs very, very well. If you want the full details on why I think Patelo is really underrated, I have made a video entirely focused on him, and I go over all the maths of the exact values of his 4-star abilities according to the uptime you actually proc this during fights, according to the healers he has on him, and if the healers have their weapons and stuff like that. Then past that, you have Andrea, who serves a similar function to Latz, I guess. Her 4-star also has full functionality, even despite Sinara's cucking of other stuff. I could potentially argue she's B tier just because I feel like these three potentially belong a bit higher in terms of ranking to her, but I've done quite a lot of testing with her versus Patelo versus Kevin, and there are a fair few scenarios where she'll test better than Kevin if he's not into weakness, for example. She'll occasionally test better than Patelo when he has Latz there. I guess that depends on how valuable the extra attack, when including his passive, is compared to the extra defensive stats Andrea gets, so that varies depending on what you're fighting into, how hard you're winning or losing, and such like that. Enzo, I guess, is the Latz equivalent. You could argue he belongs in A, just like Latz does, but I feel like bleed functions better with the imp frontline due to Sonara's passive stats with Daeron's anti-counter at the top end and attack stats. So I'm going to put him in B, particularly because full cav builds can realistically function better at the mid-spender level with female weakness hybrids because of the stats that Salma, Leila give, and then the pair of Jaime and Enzo. So I'll keep him in B. Drake, on the same logic as that, you could put him there, but Bleed isn't the synergy type for Spearman, so I will rank him lower. If you're running Spear Bleed for whatever reason, he will of course go up to the tier up here. Same note as Enzo, if you're running mid-spender Bleed Cav, he'll be A tier also. But just for a general tier list, including all these little factors, I'll keep it like this. Merrel probably belongs in B. Similar logic to Enzo, in that the other synergy types potentially can accommodate Cav a little bit better. The issue Merrel has also, which you probably wouldn't realize unless you test it, is for some reason this skill does not synergize with Sinara at all. Only the default normal attacks actually contribute towards this 4 normal attacks. The extra attacks from Sinara doesn't actually count for whatever reason. I cannot give you an explanation for that. I can only tell you what I have found from testing and looking at reports. Barret has that same interaction where he doesn't benefit from extra Sinara normal attacks despite his 4-star ability proccing off normal attacks. Again, there's no reasoning I can give you behind this. It may well just be a bug. It potentially could be fixed in the future if so. Barret does perform surprisingly well despite that though. I thought he'd be worse when I tested him, considering the reputation he seemed to have when I asked other Bleed players about him. But he's actually fairly decent. For sure, nothing special though, and he will not be getting in lineups or over any of this top 8 for now. And there'll be more added to it, of course. But he is free to play, so he does potentially have a role for many people. Chris, too, also, same logic, free to play. Makes it a bit easier to bridge the entry barrier into this build, because it is very hard to open that door and actually start a Bleed build, especially if you're a long-time player and you potentially already have stuff on your account. So, for example, if I look at my Dragon, if I swap to Bleed, these 4 Dragon skills would be... Well, actually, Assist would be fine. But Follow-Up, Strong Assault, and Tear would all be totally useless, and I'd effectively have to remove them all from my Dragon, and totally rebuy new Legion skills to fill my Dragon with Flame and Bleed. I guess in terms of needing the enablers and Rhea and Sinara, that's basically the same as other synergy types anyway. For weakness, you need Jaime and his healers. I guess for female, you only really need Leila. But as far as synergy goes, you're going to need the gold 4-star epic token commanders. It's just the fact that nothing else can be hybrid in with Bleed. It really does make it a bit tricky, because you have to get rid of everything you've built up on your account already and fully commit to setting up a Bleed build. Stuff like Andrea, Patelo, Latz, at least, can be used in other stuff, but Kevin, not really. Rhea, no. Sinara, definitely not. So yeah, it can be a bit tricky. Stuff like Hector, Gorell, Arslan, Robb, all just very basic stat givers for this build. Hector isn't basic, I guess. His 4-star ability will, in theory, work. But as I said, with Drake, you're not going to be running spears with Bleed realistically, or you shouldn't be if you have a choice. Maybe if you're mono spear in refinement and you're running 3 synergy lines in UT or something like that, is pretty much the only logical place I can envision actually running Bleed spears. So perhaps he could have a role there, but I don't know. He's not good with Bleed, purely because of his troop type bias. I guess Meranda will basically fall under the same thing. Laena can maybe go a bit higher, purely because Cav is more easily accommodated here. Julien, for the same reason. He can be okay as a 5th commander maybe for Bleed Cav builds for mid-spenders. Hayley, she doesn't function with the build at all because of her 4-star ability, but she is infantry. She should realistically be in D, but you could maybe run a low-spending lineup of Sinara, Rhea, Barret, Chris, Hayley, and that'd be somewhat okay. So maybe she belongs in C because of that, but I'll keep her there for now. But yeah, that could be an option as the lowest price bleed build available. Seg, basic. His 4-star will work, to be fair, so maybe shouldn't go into D, but you should never realistically be running Seg. Then it's a few more of these premium commanders. I'll do Dany and Baelish first, I guess. Dany is B or A. I don't feel comfortable putting her in a tier with Julien or something, so I'll put her in A. I don't think she's necessarily good compared to some of these alternatives, but if you can get good value on her dragon attack, she can still realistically outscale some of the mid-spender options. So her 4-star has 2 parts attached to it. You have this latter part, which is entirely built around her active skill, which is obviously invalidated because of Sinara. So the active cooldown reduction is irrelevant, the disarm effect can't work, but this allied dragon attack will go off regardless, and you can see in some reports this can kill over 1 million troops actually if you're like rallying someone's castle. It can quite easily and consistently be like 10% of your damage across an entire fight, purely because of the fact it hits into all lines. So even if you're running like Imp Spear on your wall and you have Cav even behind those two, this will hit your bows on the 4th line, and you will not have bow health or bow defense, so they will get absolutely demolished. It's the same logic I said about with why Daeron was so good. So Dany can be okay, but she does have a notable amount of anti-synergy with the build because of Sinara. Baelish, he can't proc early because you can't weakness attack, but if you look at his tooltip, he will proc after 25 seconds regardless, and female builds, which is what he's primarily going to counter, is your counter because of their disarm effects on Cersei and Daenerys. So potentially having him to counter females a bit is decent. Against weakness players, he will have the reversal effect on the 30 and 40 second actives for 4-star commanders, and the same for female players who aren't running Selma. If it is a female player running Selma, he'll only hit the 30 second actives, but potentially reversing 2.5 of those 5 actives is actually not bad in terms of a damage swing. So I don't think you can put him in like one of these trash tiers realistically, purely because of that. Sandor, he does synergize well with the build. He procs off normal attacks, and he has silencing effects, which is basically invalidated because Sinara does it anyway. The only issue is this was looking like a high number, and it is. It will only hit one lineup. So if you have your front line being Imp, you'll have A1, A2, A3, A4, A5. This will only hit, say, A1. And the reason he's lower tier than these other 4, I mean, these 3 are untouchable. And then Daeron is better because this will hit, say, 200% scaling on A1, A2, A3, A4, A5. So that's 1000% scaling. And then it will also be hitting B1, B2, B3, B4, B5, and so on as well. So this will scale way, way further than Sandor's 4-star will. And if he was the best 5th option, he could maybe go up to S. But realistically, Night King is probably a bit better than him. I'm not comfortable putting Night King in S because he does actually have anti-synergy with Sinara. This doesn't go off when Sinara is there. So this doesn't go off, and then his 2-star upgrade also doesn't go off. So that's 2 fairly fundamental parts of his kit which don't work because of Sinara. But this works regardless, and this will act as about a 5% army size increase in practice on the maths I did in my Night King video previously. So if you're rallying with like 6 mil troops, this will basically on practice average out as an extra 300k army size in practice when you account for the uptime and whatnot, plus the attack buffs too. So he will just get a lot of value purely from the raw numbers of him. But I don't think you can put him in this tier, because these 4 together will be pretty much all your damage output. And I'd also be surprised if you were facing weakness if Kevin didn't actually test better than Night King, which sounds weird to say, but I'm pretty sure that's correct, because Kevin is just so ridiculous into how weakness attacks actually function. So as far as what a full whale build goes, if we're doing lineup recommendations, you'll want to do that realistically. That's the best you'll get. Potentially, as I said, with Kevin subbing in for when you know you're going to be facing into weakness. For mid-spender builds, you will want some variation of these 6 commanders realistically if you're running Imp Cav, Imp, something like that. And if you're running Mono Cav, you would probably want some variation of this, I'd say. You'd probably have to test which of Laena and Merrel ends up better. Probably Merrel, realistically, despite the fact he doesn't actually synergize with Sinara. And then Spear Bleed, just get out of it, don't even think about it. Just run weakness, just run female, it will perform significantly better. And yeah, I think that's pretty much how I'd rank commanders for bleed. I think that looks correct to me. Tell me if you disagree with any of these picks, though, of course.